could you talk a bit about the political climate on campus and in Madison in general, and how that stirred you to
Back then.
yeah, how it stirred you to take up the camera and make the film.
Well, I didn't pick up a camera for a while. I was a freshman in 1968, being affected by the same events you saw in the film. I remember my parents dropping me off. I was from West Orange, New Jersey, and they drove out and proudly dropped me off on the campus. And I think the day after they left, the Wisconsin Draft Resistance Union slipped a leaflet under my door, my dorm room door, come to a meeting to hear about the draft. And I don't think I was so oblivious I said, like, well, what's the draft? But it wasn't far from that. And from that point forward, my life was changing radically by the intensity. Now, clearly there was a strong element among men of self-interest, because it didn't, with that hanging over your head, it demanded that you learn about this war 8,000 or 10,000 miles away, and there was certainly no good news about it. And in that climate, you had to make a decision. It was impossible to stay neutral. You were either going to be for the war and possibly go there, or you're going to be against the war. And like Paul Sagan said, pretty quickly, at least for me, that really wasn't going to be an option. I'd rather be trying to stop the war.
And yeah, I mean, in re-seeing the film was really striking. And one thing that was on my mind was, how could you talk a bit about the process of amassing all the footage that appears in the film, and how much material were you working with, and could you just elaborate on the whole process of whittling it down to?
Well, you can see that.
Watch?
Is this thing on?
Yeah.
And there's Blake Kellogg, who appears in the very beginning of the film, was a news director at Madison, one of the stations. And when he left in the very early 70s, he took everything that was shot throughout his tenure as news director and gave it over to the Wisconsin Historical Society. And they were just boxes and boxes and boxes. As a matter of fact, how they had organized, if you can want to call it organized, they would, have a nightly news. And then they would take the negative that was shown that night, and they would basically using masking tape it to the night before's footage, all in 16, almost all in negative, sometimes with a little mag strap, sometimes with an optical track. And then they would fill up a can, and they would throw that can into a box. They would fill up that box. They would tape it up. They'd put it into a room. And they went on and on and on for, over a decade. And sometimes they marked the boxes, and sometimes they didn't. And so I met Glenn in Boston, and I was dying to do something in movies. And Glenn was doing. He had always decided, I'm going to make this movie. So I went out to Madison. And somebody had to start going through all those boxes. And so there I was in the Historical Society. And the very first box that I opened up, or they gave me, I don't think it was marked, but it was October 1967.
Right. Oh.
And it was Dow. And that's what I watched for that first month, every day, going in and watching that event unfold for me. And even by it was so much stuff. Even from Dow itself. Dow was, there was Senate hearings, it was all kinds of stuff. And as you see the wealth of material that we had, it even, we did in that first year, when there was a team of 4 of us originally, and we did a book that I wish I had. Oh, you have it? That's good. That basically detailed the history and was detailing also what footage we had. And I believe that somebody actually even used our research in that book for a degree, right? Some sort of a master's
I'm
degree?
not sure about that, but what Barry's saying is right.
I'm sure.
We were very lucky that, I mean, I wanted to do this film. I'd thought about it for almost 2 years before I actually started working on it, before I'd met Barry. And without a doubt, there's two unsung heroes in the film. One is Blake Kellogg, the news director, who got the ball rolling by donating this footage. The other one is George Talbot, who was the head of the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I had become quite a nuisance to him, coming by at least once or twice a week, saying, like, you know, I know there's good material here, where is it? And he was saying, it's too soon. It's only been a couple of years. We haven't collected this stuff yet. And then one day, I think almost out of pity for me, he said, Silber, get over here. This could be your lucky day. I said, really? I'm ready for it. He said, we just got this great collection from one of the stations. And we have a problem. When we went to retrieve it, it was like in a shed outside. There were mice running around. We have no clue what's in here, and we have zero budget to find out. But if you and a researcher want to come in and take a look at it, we'll make you a little deal. You put in the sweat equity, and you'll get to use any of the film you want. And that was the luckiest day of my professional life. And so over time, when Barry was so immersed in looking and fixing the splices and cleaning it and writing down all these notes, we and these two other colleagues of ours I'd been working with them on kind of a historical overview of what was happening in the war, what was happening in Madison. And Barry, once we had that sort of framework, every time we found an event like Dow, he'd write in great detailed notes, well, here's what we have. So we went through this for, I'd say, at least a year before we shot a frame of our own footage, because I feel that in a film like this, you need to know what exists on film before you start running around and trying to, you know, shoot things or interviews even that are supposed to connect with it. And over time, once the other two, that was the ABC affiliate, the CBS and NBC affiliate heard about it, and that they were taking like a big tax write-off, so they wanted to give the footage in. Now Barry's job was even, you know, 3 times as bad. And over time, we actually got someone else to do that research, and Barry and I became partners on the film.
But also, you know, we'd done all this research. And there was certain events that we said, like that very first demonstration, which we knew had existed, but it wasn't in the Blake Kellogg footage. And with these other two stations coming in, we found that very first demonstration.
And that is the first demonstration in the United States of more than 2 people. There was one demonstration where 2 guys went in front of the White House with a sign. And the fact that it's on film and that Paul Soglin, student leader, was actually there, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's amazing to have the value and to appreciate that. One of the problems we did have, I'll just jump in and say, is that almost all the footage in the film that you saw, which was the negative footage where they would shoot it and then they'd talk about it on TV, almost all of it was silent. So
a lot of it, yeah.
So we have Susan Lazarus is here somewhere. Susan was one of our A-plus sound editors, and Barry mentioned Tommy Fleischman. I'll let people know this was his first sound mix, and he did an A-plus job. And the sound, it's mono sound, but with this new digital sound, it sounds even better than our old 35, I think, which was so good. So we had at one point, just to kind of bring this thing to life, I think I can divulge, we had a sound effects picnic in Madison, Wisconsin, where we bought a couple kegs of beer for our 30 best friends and went through Hell No, We Won't Go and all those things. But without that little extra feeling of being there, I don't think it would have been as effective.
And another thing I was curious about, revisiting the film was, I'd be curious to hear what the two of you, how making the film sort of informed your shared perspective on sort of like contemporary protest culture right now. I mean, I'm thinking about like the Occupy movement, but I'm also thinking, there was an action against, against the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh just last week. So
I really feel strongly about this, and I appreciate it's been 50 years, in my view, since our country was this politically polarized, this politically divided. Then it was about the war, and don't forget it was about two warmongering presidents who were very powerful. And those guys destroyed their presidency because of the war and the movement that defied them. And so I think when we look back on that dark time, because it was kind of Dickensian, for us as young people, it was like the best of times, but it was clearly the worst of times for a lot of people. It's a cliche, I guess. And so it's just a matter today, I think the missing narrative is to understand that you can draw, I believe you can draw a direct line from 1968 and the political culture that was born, starting with civil rights certainly, but much more aggressively in certain ways in terms of confrontation, with what we have today. And that if we hadn't had these demonstrations, and you see just how, what's the anti-war movement? It's an 8-year political resistance campaign with one goal in mind, to stop the war. So here we are today, 50 years later, and we know the kind of damage that's being done right now by another, I won't even say his name. So I think if there's any lessons that I feel, what resonates to me is I take heart that we've been in dark times before. And now we learned this week, by the way, which is the biggest mind blower, which some of us feared at the time, that William Westmoreland, who appears for a couple seconds on a helicopter, he had a plan to move nuclear weapons into Vietnam in 1968. And if you remember, I think Johnson resigned in March or early April. And, for him to be the one to say no, to me, means we were having an effect. A big effect, and who knows, much bigger than we even understood at the time. So I feel like the film, now, we released it 39 years ago, but I feel it has a new role to play, and that's why we decided to do this together. We're doing it on our own. We haven't signed up with a distributor. It's a totally DIY operation. But thanks to Sandra's group, they've done a beautiful job of preserving. First of all, we had to preserve this history on film, because in 16 millimeter, no one watches that anymore. What are you going to show, a VHS tape or even a DVD? So now we have it in a format that not only is it playing here tonight, I want to mention to you before I forget, if anyone tonight was moved by the film or feels it's got a value to play, on Friday night, the film is opening downtown at the Metrograph Cinema for a week, and we think possibly a whole lot longer. One of the people we neglected to thank earlier, I was meaning to do it, is Jake Perlin, who is the programmer of this new cinema. It's only a couple years old in the Lower East Side. His life was somewhat changed when he saw the film. He told me as a teenager, and he wants to do everything in our power. And it's really thanks to Jake that we're sitting here tonight. We didn't even apply. He did it for us. So if you think the film has a role to play, when you go home tonight or tomorrow and the next few days, when you mention it to a friend that you saw it, please encourage them to go down this weekend to the Metrograph, because if we do well, Jake said, Glenn, if your film does business, I'll play it forever. So let's hear it for Jake Perlin.
Barry, do you have anything to add about?
Yeah, let's hear it for Jake Perlin.
All right, I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. I think we've sort of like implicitly touched on this a bit, but I'm just curious. I mean, you both just revisited the film. What do you think? What do you think the legacy of the war at home is now? And
of the film?
Yeah.
Or the war at home? I think the legacy of the war at home is yet to be determined. When we first released it, we were honored. It was nominated for an Oscar. It won the top prize at a couple festivals like Chicago, and it was the forerunner to Sundance. And that felt good. And then it played around for a year or two, and it went on PBS. And then sort of was our distributor, which was ironic since we started the company, sort of threw it in one of those boxes and didn't do anything with it. And I had recently moved out west to Santa Fe and wasn't really that connecting to the community until the women's marches. And afterwards, I had brought a DVD into one of our art house cinemas. I said, you might want to consider playing this now, because it seems to be the zeitgeist again of resistance. It's back, and this can help. Most people don't know this history, and certainly younger people don't really know it, and there's really no way for them to know it. Here's a factoid that might blow your mind. We are now today as many years away from 1968 as we were in 1968 to World War I, okay? the war that ended all wars, that had zero impact on my life. Now, this is part of, I think, a much more contemporaneous vibe because it does connect. What you see in this film, I don't think you could have had the women's marches in the same way or the March Against Gun Violence or Occupy Wall Street if we hadn't really created that political culture. And we can't lose that. We can't let these other side, these reckless people win. That's not an option, folks. So I'm here to tell you, we have got to realize that we are in a deep, dark place, but we've been there before, and if we stick together, we can win. That's my takeaway. This film, to me, plays stronger today than it did when we had our world premiere 39 years ago. We just have to get it out there, and we need your support in that sense to spread the word, get people, because a lot of cinemas around the country are telling our film workers, they're all waiting to see what happens at the Metrograph, if people will come and do it. We do have a good booker. He's booked it. We're going from here to San Francisco and Berkeley, to Detroit for a week, then San Francisco and Berkeley, then LA, then Portland, then Chicago. That's already kind of getting going. But again, we're doing it by ourselves. It's a seat-of-the-pants operation, and we're just hoping that we can tap into that zeitgeist of resistance and make a difference again today, because I really feel this film has a better role to play. When we finished it 4 years after the war, it was a little bit like, oh yeah, we were good, we got it together, we stopped the war, we're great. Well, some of that, but really this history stands for itself. And I think every level of resistance is revealed in this film. And, much as I care for Carl Armstrong and I consider him a friend, I don't think we need to be doing that again. In this climate, post 9/11 climate, that's just an invitation to fascist response. So we can learn from this. I think we can be proud of this history. We did play a role, but we're not done. We can't be. That's my political speech.
All right, we're going to take some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone. Let's start right here.
I am so happy that this has been restored, because the rewriting of history and the projection of what you show is how it went from peaceful demonstrations to the desperation of trying to stop this war. And Carl Armstrong and other people who attacked property, or cops attacked bodies in this country, and the hundreds of thousands of people killed in Vietnam, people forget. They just hear about how violent the anti-war movement was. And so I think that this film really puts back into context what happened and how desperate we all were, many of us in this room, to stop that fucking war.
3 million, not hundreds of thousands. 58,220 Americans, and the new estimate is over 3 million Vietnamese, about close to a third or more being just civilians. For what?
I feel very grateful to you for your persistence in making the documentary and for now making it possible for us to see it. But I'm wondering if you have plans for making it available on a DVD, because there are people who don't live near some of these major cities or are overseas and would like to see this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, we're going to make it available. Like I said earlier, if you're in a 16 millimeter, you can't show it anywhere. So we had to go through this exercise for the last year with Indie Collect. And I'm so grateful to Sandra and Israel and the whole team there, because she approached me. I don't even know if we would have known about doing it. I didn't even know this is what she was doing. She was one of the original distributors of the film, and Sandra is one of the real, I call the godmother of the independent film movement in this country. And so we want to make it as available in every format possible. Mostly that'll be digital in the end if we're successful. It hasn't even been on television in like 36 years. So we have a lot of work to do still.
I saw it recently streamed. It must have been through PBS, yes?
I'll have to look into
They
it.
weren't supposed
You don't
to.
know? What?
They weren't supposed to.
I wasn't supposed to?
No, they weren't
Oh.
supposed to be streaming it.
Oh, they weren't
It may have
supposed-
been on YouTube. Maybe you saw it.
No. It was on. It was definitely, a bona fide.
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't
Well,
have the right to do it. But
okay. I guess so. Well, listen. Do you plan to show this in Madison on your tour? And by the way,
course.
I was in Madison then, and
We do.
You do. Good.
There was a big reunion in Madison this summer, and it was called the Madison Reunion. But it wasn't a college reunion; it was an anti-war reunion. There were 800 people there, and it wasn't really ready yet, but we did show it in a 4K version. We had 2 screenings that were called sneak previews because tonight is the actual premiere of this 4K restoration. And yes, we're going to be showing it. Right now, we're trying to go Madison someplace we can always kind of show it. So we're trying to take it. We have limited time and money really to do this. It's a lot of work, believe it or not. And so probably I would say after the new year, we'll bring it back there to not only to Madison, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. We know where we showed it, where it was successful 39 years ago, and we hope to bring it back to all those places. And by the way, if it does well here in New York, we're going right over to Berkeley and San Francisco, which are landmark theaters, and in LA, which are top-of-the-line art house cinemas. If we do well there, I think they'll play it in their 40 other theaters. So right now, the pressure is really on us to deliver and make sure we can prove that what we believe is that it does have another role to play now.
Sure it does.
I was curious, towards the end of the film, it seemed like people in some of the students in the resistance movement seemed a little bit like burned out, like maybe they weren't feeling like they had an effect. It seems like afterwards, the way you guys are talking about it now, you did feel like the protests had a major effect. I'm curious what you think it actually, how effective the protests were influencing policy in Washington.
Well, I think they had it, but I think that there was a lot of people who were a little burned out. I think there was a lot of people who had expected the war to end earlier. I think that there was people that also felt as if there was going to be much bigger changes throughout the society. So I think that maybe they weren't a little.
Well, clearly our leaders, so-called leaders, I should say, haven't learned anything because what's interesting to me is how, I'm not sure it's going to answer your question exactly as far as the people there, they were desperate. That's what the actions showed at the end. And, if you've been fighting the same cause for 5, 6, 7 years, you do think, well, how can I top what we did last time? But I don't know. I just think that right now our leaders have learned nothing, except some of the political commentary is interesting now in the current regime because whereas Vietnam for a long time was referred to as a mistake, okay, just a mistake that spent $1 trillion, killed a few million people, that's a mistake. Then it was elevated over time to a tragic mistake, which wasn't much progress. Well, now I remember watching, I think, Morning Joe with whatever Joe's name is, talking one time about how many hits the middle class has taken and how it all started with Vietnam, and it all started because we were lied into that war. Does that sound familiar? Remember this little war called Iraq that was probably even a bigger foreign policy disaster, if that's possible? So I think now it's a turning point. People say that Vietnam in '68 was when the public started losing faith in our government. Well, that's probably kind of an understatement, at least as far as I'm concerned. I have very little faith in our government, and I really have faith in you all and me all and my partner here that if we are as determined as we were back then, and it's really coming down right now to this election in front of us. Look what's happened to Wisconsin. The progressive state, one of the most progressives. Some guy just wrote a book about how, I think it's called The Fall of Wisconsin. It is a red state right now. We're about to take back the governorship, thank God, from that idiot who's like a David Koch, imbecile wannabe. And so, right now we have no choice. It's not like an option that we're going to sit around and see how it turns out. So I'm ready to go out there while I'm talking now in a way I've never done before. I always used to let the film do our talking for us, but I think we're beyond that now. And what bothers me the most is that I think there's a sense of urgency now around the election, this whole Kavanaugh thing, but what we're missing is organization. And the reason that, look at the Dow demonstration, which I think is possibly the most important demonstration from my analysis in the entire period. You had a group of people that Paul says became educated. They learned about what's behind the war. They learned about what napalm was about. They confronted the authorities, And they tried to play nice. They had the little placards, and they tried to rely on the morality of the students going in to see these napalm makers. And then over another 6 months or a year time, they finally said, enough playing nice, we're going to block these people from going in. And you saw what the reaction was, and that is what the turning point of the Madison anti-war movement, the exact same week in October that they're blocking troop trains in Oakland, they're beating people for doing it, who were taking the soldiers to the airport to go to Vietnam. People got organized, they got smart, and they forced the issue. Hank's line about SDS is kind of on the money, I think. You don't talk people into doing things. If you're really on board, you take an action and you force them to confront the situation, and then you can really have a political dialogue with each other about why this is going on. And I don't know, I mean, a lot of us are veterans of that period, and some of us have gray hair now or no hair. And I just feel like we can't rest on any laurels that we think we achieved 50 years ago. We have to be teaming up with young people, and we need them to lead us back into a better place.
Unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there, and it's also an appropriate note to end it on. So
let me just invite everyone. There's so many friends here that worked on the film, that are lifelong friends of ours, some of whom went to Madison, some of whom just know us from our work. But we don't have any big money for a party, but we are, many of us, going to go over to PJ Clark's, which I've been talking to, and they are donating the whole downstairs if people want to have a beer, continue the conversation. I want to thank you and the film festival, Kent Jones. This means a lot to us. When you're a young filmmaker, you just dream about someday making a film that's good enough. And Barry knows this story as well as I do, to be at the New York Film Festival. It took us 39 years to get here. Let's make the most of it.
thank you both.